Hello and welcome to the Bible Difficulties and Answers podcast. I'm your host, Lance Smith. Today we're diving deep into a fascinating and thought-provoking topic for our second episode in this series, the structural integrity and seaworthiness of Noah's Ark as described in Genesis 6:14 through 15. Can a wooden ark truly withstand the violent flood depicted in the Bible? First up, we'll explore the insights of entertainer and science communicator Bill Nye, famously known as the Science Guy. Bill Nye has some strong opinions on Noah's Ark, and we'll be dissecting his thoughts on the matter. Next, we'll scrutinize the dimensions of the ark as laid out in Genesis. Do they actually make for a seaworthy vessel? We'll dive into the specifics and see what modern science has to say about this ancient design. Finally, we'll look at a fascinating study conducted by 4 physics students who, despite their biases, took on the challenge of evaluating the feasibility of building and sailing such a colossal wooden structure. What did their findings reveal? Can such a vessel, as grand as described, really hold up? As usual, I'll present a number of different opinions from my research and conclude with my own thoughts. Show notes will include links to all we discuss. Are you ready to dive in? All right, let's learn together. Genesis 6:14 through 15 from the New Living Translation. Build a large boat from cypress wood and waterproof it with tar inside and out. Then construct decks and stalls throughout its interior. Make the boat 450 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet high. Now, the problem as defined by the Big Book of Bible Difficulties is this. The ark was only made of wood and carried a heavy cargo, but a worldwide flood produces violent waters that would have broken it into pieces. Refer to Genesis 7:4 and 11. Now, the solution for the Big Book of Bible Difficulties is this. First, the ark was made of a strong and flexible material called gopher wood in some translations that gives without breaking. Second, the heavy load was an advantage that gave the ark stability. Third, naval architects inform us that a long, box-shaped floating boxcar such as the ark was a very stable craft in turbulent waters. Indeed, modern ocean liners follow the same basic dimensions or proportions of Noah's Ark. Now, quick aside, folks, gopher wood. Now, that's not a material we're familiar with today. Most scholars believe it may refer to pine or cedar or cypress wood. All right, well, first, let's begin with a popular entertainer from today. In a December 16th, 2015 article, Bill Nye explains the implausibility he thinks about the story of Noah and the ark, where he says, and I quote, "And we can then run a test, scientific tests. People in the early 1900s built an extraordinarily large wooden ship, the Wyoming. It was a 6-masted schooner, the largest one ever built, and it had a motor on it for winching and cables and stuff. But this boat had a great difficulty. It was not as big as the Titanic, but it was a very long ship. It would twist in the sea. It would twist this way, and this way, and this way. With all that twisting, it leaked, and it leaked like crazy. The crew could not keep the ship dry. And indeed, it eventually foundered and sank, and the loss of all 14 hands. So there were 14 crewmen aboard a ship built by very skilled shipwrights in New England. These guys were the best in the world at wooden shipbuilding, and they could not build a boat as big as the ark is claimed to have been. Is that reasonable? Is that possible? That the best shipbuilders in the world could not do what 8 unskilled people, men and their wives, were able to do, close quote. So, is Bill Nye's argument convincing? Not really. Remember, Nye is an entertainer known as the Science Guy, not a professional scientist. While the facts he highlights to make his point are accurate, he leaves out some crucial details that would provide a fuller, more complete story. We're going to cover those missing pieces next with our upcoming research segment. From the I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist podcast, Inside Noah's Ark with Dr. Tim Chaffee. This is from November 24, 2023, and we covered part of this in last week's podcast. Let's begin with this segment between Frank Turek and Tim Chaffee. Frank Turek, would Noah's Ark float? Is it seaworthy according to the description? Tim Chaffee, yeah, actually, it's got the right dimensions of what our large ships do today. Like a 6-to-1 ratio, the length to width and everything, which we have for our large vessels. A lot of people will say, like Bill Nye, the guy who plays the Science Guy, says you can't build wooden ships that large because they just sink. There's too many problems. And he uses the example of the Wyoming, which was built in the early 1900s. It was 430 feet long from tip to tip. So not quite the size of the ark, but pretty big. And he says the problem is when you put it on the water, it twisted and bent and all these leaks, and then it sank and 14 people on board were killed. And that's true. But he never mentions the fact that it carried thousands of tons of cargo back and forth across the Atlantic for almost 15 years. You can build something that large. There's just certain challenges that need to be overcome. But if you know what they are, they can be overcome. But now we don't make large vessels out of wood. You don't need to. You can do it cheaper and sturdier when you're using steel or other metals. Frank Turek. And so the ship was seaworthy for 15 years. Noah's Ark would have had to be seaworthy for about a year. Tim Chaffee. Yeah, well, maximum of 5 months before it lands on the mountains of Ararat. And then the water starts going down after that. Yeah, close quote. Okay, once again, Bill Nye omits some key and crucial details. For instance, the Wyoming, a large wooden ship, sailed across the Atlantic for 15 years before it eventually floated and sank. In contrast, Noah's Ark only needed to be seaworthy for 5 months. These details are important for a full understanding of the feasibility of the ark, and we'll explore them further in our next segment. Author Matt Slick, from his April 30th, 2008 article, Could Noah's Ark Hold All the Animals?, says the following. The dimensions of the ark have a ratio of 6:1. The ark was 6 times longer than it was wide. That is the best ratio for modern shipbuilding. Model stability tests have shown that the design is stable for waves up to 200 feet high, and that the ark could have rotated 90 degrees and still righted itself. Right, now you may be thinking, of course, Christian apologists would tell this story, but what about secular science publications? Would they offer a different perspective? Let's turn to the Smithsonian Magazine. Probably not a source you expected here. According to the Media Bias/Fact Check website, the Smithsonian Magazine is rated as pro-science with a very high factual reporting. Here's their definition of pro-science. These sources consist of legitimate science or are evidence-based through the use of credible scientific sourcing. Legitimate science follows a scientific method, is unbiased, and does not use emotional words. These sources are also respect the consensus of experts in the given scientific field and strive to publish peer-reviewed science, close quote. Perfect. Now that we have established it operates from a solid scientific basis, let's conclude with a detailed verification of the ark's dimensions from Smithsonian Magazine. From the April 4th, 2014 article, Could Noah's Ark Float? In theory, yes, by Helen Thompson. She writes how 4 physics students at the University of Leicester put the biblical account to text. From the article, she writes, So, if one could hypothetically build an ark to the specifications outlined in the Bible and actually cram 2 of every species on the boat, would it float? Or would Noah have found himself in a Titanic-like scenario? That's what 4 physics graduate students at the University of Leicester wondered. As part of a special course that encourages the students to apply basic physics principles to more general questions, the team did the math and found that an ark full of animals in those dimensions could theoretically float. They recently published their research in a peer-reviewed publication, the Journal of Physics Special Topics. You don't think of the Bible necessarily as a scientifically accurate source of information, so I guess we were quite surprised when we discovered it would work, said Thomas Morris, one of the students who worked on the project, in a statement. To float, a boat has to exert the same amount of force on the ocean as the weight of the water it displaces. This buoyancy force is essentially the biggest weight the ark could hold and not sink. To put it another way, an object with a density greater than water will sink. So if the Bible gives an approximate volume of the ark, and after factoring in the mass of the wood used to build it, one could figure out how much mass the system could take before it becomes more dense than the water and sinks. Now that we've defined the constraints on the system, what in the world is a cubit? Ancients defined a cubit as the distance between a person's elbow to the tip of their middle finger. In modern units, this can typically range from 45.5 centimeters to 52.3 centimeters. In their study, the students decided on an average length of their calculations, 48.2 centimeters. This means that, by their approximations, the ark would have been 144.6 meters long, 24.1 meters wide, and 14.46 meters tall, the size of a very small cargo ship. They went with cypress wood, though pine and cedar wood have similar densities. Using the density of cypress, they calculated the weight of this hypothetical ark, 1,200,000 kilograms. By comparison, the Titanic weighed almost 53 million kilograms. Based on the density of seawater, they figured out that an empty box-shaped ark would float with its hull only dipping 0.34 meters into the water. But what about an ark filled with human and animal cargo? Working backwards, they assumed that the maximum weight would put the waterline just below the top of the ark. If the ark is immersed beyond its full height, water would spill into the vessel and the ark would capsize. Forcing the bulk of the ark down into the water while still keeping it afloat would displace about 20 Olympic-sized swimming pools worth of seawater. Knowing the volume of displaced seawater and knowing that an object in water displaces its own weight, they crunched the numbers and found that the total mass needed to displace that water. They subtracted the mass from an empty ark and found that the ark could hold 50,540,000 kilograms. For some perspective, the average sheep is about 23.47 kilograms, so the biblical boat could have held as many as 2.15 million sheep. Back to me. All right, as you recall from last week's podcast, the total weight capacity of the ark exceeds what's needed to hold 1,400 kinds of animals. It's fascinating how the biblical description of the ark size aligns with the dimension of modern ships. This alignment suggests that similar wooden ships could indeed survive and float for the necessary period to withstand a great flood. Moreover, when actual scientists undertake the proper research, the biblical account often remains true and confirmed. And a quick reminder, when you hear people calling themselves the science guy, remember they are first and foremost entertainers, not scientific experts. In our next episode, we're going to dive into Genesis 7:24 to determine whether the flood rains lasted 40 days or 150 days. You may reach us at our website, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers.podbean.com, or you may reach out to me directly at our email address, BibleDifficultiesAndAnswers@gmail.com, with any questions, comments, concerns, fits of righteous indignation, or just to say hi. Also, please like and subscribe to this podcast. Tell a friend or two as well. Also, write a review and give it a 5-star rating on Apple Podcast, Podbean, Spotify, or any of your podcast venues of choice. It really does help get the word out about the most amazing book ever written. Again, I'm Lance Smith. Until next time, I wish you good luck, good health, and God bless. So long, everybody.